So in this session, I do want to share a brief agenda. We'll talk through the types of records that are available for NC Live. So for some of the folks that are joining us from out of state, I can speak to what we provide for our member libraries in North Carolina. I'll also share some free resources that we list on our A to Z list of databases. But there might be some that you don't necessarily have a subscription to at your institution. I'll get into tips and we'll go through kind of two main case studies that I've compiled. I'll cover some resources for later, and then we'll go into Q&A as well. And with that, I do want to share the slides. You're welcome to follow along. So I'll drop the links in the chat for the slides in the handout. The handout includes some resources from Heritage Quest, from Ancestry as well for African American genealogy research. I have a title list of books that I think are particularly useful. And then I've also linked to some LibGuides from UNC Greensboro and UNC Chapel Hill that are particularly helpful with respect to African American genealogy in North Carolina. All right, anytime you have a question, feel free to send in a chat. You're welcome to send it into the whole group or private message me that chat. I'll be checking that periodically throughout the session. So just a quick poll that I will launch. Let me get back to this. Let's see. Start that poll. Oh, apologies for that. The poll did not, was copied from a previous one. I don't know why it didn't fix the other one. But what I will say is just share in the chat your experience with African American genealogy research techniques. So novice, intermediate, advanced. Just want to get an idea of where people are coming from. I was good until Ancestry started charging for everything. Yes. Yeah, that's frustrating. Novice. Okay, definitely. And we'll talk through Heritage Quest, which is a resource that we license for our member libraries that is free and doesn't involve any sort of like DNA testing feature like Ancestry does. My question for you all also to share in the chat is, what has been your biggest challenge with African American genealogy? It looks like folks in the chat are sharing mostly novice, and then Tim sharing pretty experienced. Great. So again, just share in the chat, what's been your biggest challenge? So we have somebody sharing reading and understanding slave records, which we can definitely cover. Not knowing where to start, inaccuracies over time or contradictory info, incorrect information. Yeah, finding the records of women. Yeah, I get so far and then the records barely exist. Yes, definitely understand that. Yeah, so we'll talk through different strategies for finding the records of women. in dealing with various inaccuracies and contradictory information, often with names. And yeah, the scarcity of records, once you get towards like 1870, it can be very frustrating. And you have to kind of employ a couple of different strategies to deal with that. Locating census data, spelling variations of last names. Yeah, definitely. And that's something that we'll cover as well, is names are spelled in a variety of forms, nicknames are used. There's definitely a difference in care and the quality of information that the census records have for Black families in the late 19th, early 20th century. And I'll show you some examples of that. So we'll go through the types of records now. And I want to share, what does NC Live provide? So our two core resources for African American genealogy are Heritage Quest and the historic North Carolina newspaper collection. So Heritage Quest contains census records. It contains city directories, which can be a really useful method of cross-checking information, because you have in the city directories a person's occupation and address, and it's also typed, whereas the census records are handwritten, so there's a lot of room for error that you'll see. And then the historic newspaper collection, this includes hundreds of county newspapers around North Carolina that have been digitized. We have papers from 1770 all the way up until 1999 in that collection. And in terms of comparing Ancestry to Heritage Quest, I think this is useful to kind of think through because Heritage Quest is owned by Ancestry, and there are varying records between the two. So Ancestry is going to have more of those vital records, so birth and marriage. You'll also see the marriage records in like state indexes. So I'll show you that in an example in one of the case studies. There's public member trees, there's taxes, land, and will records, some more immigration records from Europe and Asia, and then school, military, and church records. And then we also have free resources that are available through the state of North Carolina that cost nothing. So for our folks that are out of state, you can use Digital NC, which is a resource that is housed at Wilson Library at UNC Chapel Hill. This is a organization that digitizes your memorabilia, social club records, church records from various cultural heritage institutions around the state. So they'll travel to a library or to a museum or to a community center in North Carolina and take items to digitize in that collection. And I'll show you some of the key exhibits that can be used for African American genealogy in that resource. The Digital Library on American Slavery is a project that is housed at UNC Greensboro. The collection includes deeds, notices, raised in slavery petitions for North Carolina, but also all the other southern states. And so that is a really useful tool for getting over the 1870 roadblock and finding information on like plantations and slave owners, which is a part of African American genealogy research. And then just an overview of kind of the types of records. So those vital records you're going to see in ancestry.com, as well as the historic newspaper collection. You can see some obituaries for North Carolina specifically. And then the family supplied and religious records, you'll see some of those in Digital NC. And then in terms of community records and oral histories, digital NC is really useful for that. There's a lot of university archives, especially for our HBCUs in North Carolina, like North Carolina A&T State or Winston-Salem State, that do have those community records. It's also, there's like a lot of things that you can kind of find through a combination of these resources and Googling certain names. So that's something that I've found with oral histories is there are a lot of public websites that include oral histories on certain like historically African American neighborhoods in North Carolina. One example being the neighborhood of Brooklyn in Charlotte is a historically African American neighborhood where there are some oral histories that are publicly available online. Other types of records. So census records, we have in Heritage Quest. Some state-specific records are available through the State Library of North Carolina. And then the Freedmen's Bureau records. So the Freedmen's Bureau was set up post-emancipation for as a method of dealing with land and property disputes and kind of allowing African American citizens in the country to have a method of like collecting information on a national level. That is available through the Library of Congress, but really it's specifically a search that is hosted by the African American History Museum in DC. So we're going to get into tips and case studies now. My first tip is write what you know. For the folks who are looking for a place to start, 1950, so the latest census, is a good starting point. And then working your way back year by year, trying to develop that paper trail for a family up until 1870. And then there are other strategies for getting over that roadblock that I'll get into. The reason I say this is patrons come to the library and have a specific family member in mind, but they may not have written down a family tree or birth dates, spousal information. And really, it's very hard to do a search off of one name alone. And so having information like parents' names, grandparents' names, their years of birth is particularly useful in the census records, as well as places lived. So it can just be a county. It doesn't need to be a particular town or city. Or it can just be the state. So I've done searches where I'm looking in Alabama and then I'm getting a county in Alabama in the census record as kind of a wider search. So our first case study is John Ray. The reason I think this is a really useful case study is I had a librarian a couple of years ago who said, I'm doing some research on John D. Ray. I can't find him in the census and in Heritage Quest, can you help me? And so he was a professor at North Carolina A&T State University, also an alumni there. And he essentially founded North Carolina's first 4-H club. Once he graduated from A&T, he was selected by Booker T. Washington to work under him at Tuskegee University. And then he came back to A&T to really grow their agriculture program. He worked towards justice for drafted African American soldiers who experienced discrimination while serving in World War I. So he's somebody of kind of minor renown. What I will say is like part of why I use this example and how I think it's helpful to share with you all is I have information on his family members that I can use partly from NCpedia, but then also from the census records, which allowed me to work my way back. My second tip is kind of clustering your research. So what I mean by that is work back as best you can. You'll find some parts of the family tree you can find more records on than others. And that's just kind of part of the challenge of genealogy research. So I start with John D. Ray. I go back every year in the census up until 1900, and I start looking at his wife Annie's family. And her father is Richard Harris, who was an educator and minister of a Baptist church in Greensboro. For his immediate family, so his father, I find in the 1900 census and the 1800 census. And then I kind of struggle with finding anything beyond that for his immediate family. And so what I did was that, okay, that's fine. Why don't I work back with his wife's side of the family and see if I can move past that 1870 roadblock? So I go with Richard Harris, who grew up in Granville County. I find his father in the 1870 census, and his mother in the Freedmen's Bureau in 1868. So I'm able with that information to move beyond what's called the 1870 roadblock. I'll kind of review this later, but it's essentially really this point where African American citizens are fully listed in the census for the first time post-Emancipation Proclamation. And so with Richard Harris, he is a teacher and minister of Mount Sinai Baptist Church. I see him in multiple census records working my way back. I also find him in the city directories listed as Richard H. Harris or Rev. Richard Harris. He was born in 1859 in Granville County. That's particularly useful when I'm looking in the census records to have that birth year, because there are multiple Harrises in Granville County, and it allows me to distinguish with his name and his wife's name that he is the actual Richard Harris that I'm looking for. He went to Shaw University thinking that he wanted to study medicine, but he ended up going into the ministry. He became a principal of Cedar Grove Academy in Roxborough before moving with his family to Greensboro and becoming a minister of Mount Sinai Baptist Church. So this is an example that I'll go into Heritage Quest and show you where those pain points that come up, like misspellings of names in the census, I've definitely seen firsthand with this example. So in 1870, I'll show you, he is listed as Richessel, as you can see here. It's not Richard at all. And that can be really frustrating. So that's where other family members' names come into play and are useful. And then I work back with his parents and found them listed in 1880, in the 1870 census. And then in the Freedmen's Bureau records, I find his mother is listed in a dispute over cotton. And this is a search, as I mentioned, it is powered by the African American History Museum in DC. You can search by last or first name, and by state as well. The digitized records, you can't zoom in or zoom out on like you would in Heritage Quest. I'll show you what that looks like. But you do have like a transcription of the record that is particularly helpful. So I see here, it's not actually 1868, it's 1866. Sorry for that error. Excuse me, sorry about that. But she has a dispute with Jack Winston about cotton that she was supposed to have woven for him, but she uses the cotton herself. This case is settled, but then I'm able to take the information, okay, Jack Winston, and I'm able to find, okay, Winston family, Granville County, and I'm able to find that the Obadiah Winston tobacco farm was a plantation in Granville County. I was then able to look at the slave schedules, and the problem with the slave schedules is it is hard to distinguish individual people because they are not listed by their names. But that's kind of how far I was able to work back with John D. Ray's family. And another tip that I'll share before we get into Heritage Quest itself is different time periods require different approaches. The census changes every 10 years. 1850 is when free African American citizens are listed individually for the first time, but the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect 13 years later. What that means is the slave schedules are particularly important for 1850 and 1860. 3.9 million people are listed in these slave schedules, making up 40% of the population in the southern states at the time. With those slave schedules, you do have to search by owner name, and I'll show you what that looks like. The 1890 census, most of it was destroyed in a fire, so only fragments exist for North Carolina. This is so frustrating for genealogy research for North Carolinians, but you have to kind of take this leap from 1900 to 1880, and that can be kind of difficult to figure out what happens in those 20 years. The 1910 census, because public education is being formalized, includes questions about whether citizens attended daytime school. And then in 1940, with the Great Depression, lots of questions related to salary and employment, property value. So that's something to keep in mind is how the census changes over time. And just to review, as I mentioned, that 1870 roadblock post-emancipation for the 1870 census is the most common challenge in African American genealogy. I've included some tips from Ancestry.com as well as other resources, but that is something to keep in mind and something to communicate to patrons. So we'll jump into Heritage Quest now. So it's not obvious where the census records are from this homepage, but if you click search, and then we'll start with, let's go with the 1930 census. And I'm going to go with John D. Ray and Greensboro. All right. So John D. Ray is listed here. I see they live on 150 North Dudley Street, which is near A&T's campus. And I see his family members here. So his wife in the census, even though her name is Annie, is listed as Nanny. This I've seen across multiple instances where with African American families, sometimes the wife's name is a nickname, and that you have to kind of figure out how to like interchangeably use Annie or Nanny depending on the record in this case. His mother-in-law, Laura, so she is listed as Laura in some census records, or LARA, which is frustrating. And so in order to zoom in, one of the nice things though is the ability to zoom in Heritage Quest and hover over names to get that optical character recognition. One thing that's also useful for African American genealogy research is researching neighbors, because people did not move often. John D. Ray moves into the house of his father-in-law. So 150 North Dudley Street is their house over the course of several generations. And so what you find is people aren't moving often. They're living in the same house over generations. The same is true of their neighbors. So that's another useful tool for the census, is getting the information of neighbors to cross-check. I'm going to zoom back out, and I am going to go into the search and show you. Let's go into that 1870 census. So I've jumped many years, but for the sake of time, I do want to show you as I mentioned, you can put in county, and then I'll search here. And I see James Harris, who is John D. Ray's father-in-law's father, listed here, born in 1838, living in Oak Hill in Granville County. His wife, Elizabeth. And then Richard Harris. As you can see, some family members' names are listed correctly as Harris, and then others are Hassis. And so that's where we can zoom in and see, why is this happening? Right here. There we go. And so part of it is the way these R's are written. In the OCR. And actually, Richard is kind of, it's spelled correctly, but because of the cursive and how swoopy it is, it's read as this misspelling. So that's something to keep in mind, is like, the spelling can be weird, but if you look at the actual record and zoom in and see other family members' names, it's really just a product of handwriting. Now, what we'll do is, I do want to show how these city directories can be useful for cross-checking information about a person, and also finding their occupation. So let's look back at this example. There we go. So this is 1915. Reverend Richard H. Harris, living at 150 North Dudley Street. And as I mentioned, it's typed. So this is really great if you're struggling with misspellings of certain family members' names, is to find them in these city directories, which are available no matter the size of a city. So we're going to head back into the city directories. We'll see how far we can work back. with Richard H. Harris as the example. Oh, again, this is where location helps. So I am going to go all the way back to 1909 and see if he's listed. Yeah. So as I work back in these city directories for a person, you can often see their occupation. Because he's a member of the clergy, I see the church that he leads. But then I can also see occupations of other people in Greensboro. That's really useful also for then searching for that person in the historic newspaper collection, knowing what occupation they have, if they are a small business owner, being able to look up their business or their church in the case of this example. And so that is one of my tips, is the city directories are a really great tool if you're frustrated by the misspellings in the census records. I do want to switch gears and show you all what you can find in the historic North Carolina newspaper collection for African American genealogy. So these are really key for birth announcements, marriages, letters to the editor, social activities, and obituaries. We also have specifically African American newspapers in digital NC, and I'll show you that collection that you can explore. The reason these are useful is they are such a meticulous record of daily life in the late 19th, early 20th century in the United States. Records of when people are traveling, potentially to the state fair or for work, when people have family visiting town. There's just, like you'll see in the examples I have for John D. Ray, all these different records and articles in the historic newspaper collection. Tip 4, so using the advanced search feature, specifying your newspaper or your location can be particularly helpful if you're trying to find a person. Specifying date range, make sure to put quotation marks around full names. I forget this sometimes, and then it gives me crazy results. Don't always rely on names. So addresses, business names or church names, sports teams or schools. It's also particularly useful for African American genealogy with World War I, finding veterans listed in the newspaper, because you're getting names there that may not have appeared in the newspaper before that point. And with African American men serving in the military in World War I. So that is something, if you're trying to work back in early 20th century for African American genealogy, this is where the newspaper can be helpful, as well as unique occupations. So gas fitter, laundress, lamplighter, you can use those by, I'll show you putting quotes around the name and then using capital A and D and putting in that unique occupation. And then using abbreviations, because there's so little surface area and so much information being put into the newspaper at that time. Street names, cities, business names, even names are abbreviated. So WM for William, JOS for Joseph. You might even see in certain examples the first and middle name just being initials. And you'll see that in just a sec with this case study, as well as military titles. So Reverend Richard Harris in these newspapers is listed as Rev R.H. Harris. Took me a couple of searches to find that out. But I can see there is a lot of detail. Even this example in the middle, that was just him leaving town to go to Washington, D.C. As you can see, there's the note of he has his eye on the Roxborough post office. So that's the level of description about people's lives that ends up in the newspapers. I see here in this article about him being made a Doctor of Divinity, that he, according to this article, he's born in 1860, but in the census, he's listed as 1859. So that is where you have to kind of be creative, maybe in putting in 1859 as his birth year, or 1860, depending on the record, but also where these records are flawed, very flawed. John D. Ray, if I'm searching in the historic newspaper collection, I see him listed for his work at North Carolina A&T. I also see him being invited by Booker T. Washington to Tuskegee University in this first article here. So it's even announced that he received this telegram asking him to accept this position. So with this newspaper collection, I'm able to search for names really easily. Let me exit full screen and show you what that looks like. What's particularly useful are the clippings as well. Don't know why this is doing that. Let me log back in. All right, there we go. So let me show you this example. Harris, and then I'm putting in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I can see where he's listed. This is also where clippings come into play. So if I zoom out here, just trying to see what the article itself is. If I click clip, it basically makes it like an image cropping tool that I can then save for later. I like to title it with name, and then save the clipping to my account. If you have your patrons who are using these tools often and are really building out a full search of their family tree, I would recommend an account. You can also link your account to Ancestry or your Facebook account. And so you don't necessarily need to create a separate one like I did. What you'll notice in this list is Reverend Harris is up here, and then his neighbor, Samuel Seaver, is listed here. So that's another way that you can kind of get a fuller picture of a person's life by searching not only for them, for their family members, but also for their neighbors, their community that they are living in. I am going to exit out of here. There are a variety of ways that you can search in this collection. I'm not going to go horribly in depth with that because we have a crash course video on using this collection that's on our YouTube channel that takes you through the basics. But this is where I can add in certain keywords to a search. So I'm able to find more information here. this letter to the editor. And this is a sermon that he gave at A&M College. So let me go back. Any questions so far? I do want to get to our second case study and some more complex searching past 1870. All right, we'll keep it moving. So my other example is Simon A. Haley. The reason I chose Simon A. Haley is in doing some research of A&T alumni, I found it was very difficult to search for a particular person on name alone. It's really helpful to have other family members' names in building those clusters, as I mentioned. So Simon A. Haley graduated from NC A&T State University in 1919, and then he immediately served in World War I in France. He is the father of Alex Haley, who wrote Roots and the autobiography of Malcolm X. He was a professor at Alabama A&M University and then ended his career at Cornell University. And looking at Simon Haley, I'm able to find him in the historic North Carolina newspaper collection, getting this portrait of his life, apparently, who was part of the Glee Club there. He also is listed as being one of the soldiers leaving for military service in World War I in this article on the right-hand side here. So I have some information from the newspapers on him. I can also then work back. Oh, my animations are all over the place, but that's okay. We're working with it. So I find Simon A. Haley then in the census records listed in the 1920 census. And then I'm able to find his parents, Alexander Haley and Queen Haley in the 1880 census. And then I'm able to work back to the 1860 census to Alexander's parent, his mother, and Queen's mother, Easter. In both of these cases, the white slave owner or overseer of the plantation has fathered a child with both of their mothers. This is a situation where you then have to kind of pivot, obviously, with that 1870 roadblock and start looking at slave owners' names in the 1860 census and the slave schedules. What I found to be particularly difficult is his mother, Queen, is listed as Queen Haley, H-A-L-Y at a certain point, or Queen Hales, or Queenie Davy. So this is where the census can be frustrating for finding records of African American women. I find that their marriage announcement in the Tennessee state records is particularly useful at establishing where they are. So with Alexander Haley, who is Simon's father, he is listed in the 1880 census. And then I jump to 1860 and I'm able to find he is listed, or his mother is listed as a enslaved person of G.M. Haley's. G.M. Haley assigns William Boff as the kind of overseer of his plantation. So I'll show you kind of what that looks like in terms of searching. But the marriage announcement, as I mentioned, is a really key tool in the Tennessee state records. So Alex Haley his last name is misspelled, and Queen's last name is listed as Davy, but they are married October 9th in Hardin, Tennessee. They spend most of their life in Tennessee, in Hardin and in Savannah, which is also in Hardin County. This is also where you can then use cemetery records with this example and others to find the gravesite of a particular person. So for instance, he passed away in 1918 in Memphis. I can then use the Social Security Death Index and Heritage Quest to find that record. Queen, who Alex Haley did end up writing a book about, was born around 1857 in Lauderdale, Alabama, which is northwestern Alabama. I am able to find her mother listed in the 1860 slave schedules under James Jackson, who is the plantation owner of the Forks of Cypress Plantation. She's potentially included in the slave schedule that's enumerated in Lauderdale County in Alabama in 1860. I'm also able to find an announcement of her passing in 1941 in Savannah, Tennessee. So that's kind of where these little points of census record, slave schedules, death index, and marriage announcements are useful. This is the Forks of Cypress Plantation. There was a fire that essentially, ruined the house itself, but there muted now. My audio cut out for some reason. Sorry about that. Let me head back into my screen. Okay. So this is where I start to work back and look at information about the plantation owners. So the Forks of Cypress Plantation, where Queen Haley is born, and also the Haley Plantation, where Alexander Haley is born. So this is where I'm going to jump into the records in Heritage Quest. So I'm going to go to search and then go to 1860. And then let's see if this loads. There we go. With Alex Haley, Alexander Haley, I put in William Baugh, and I put in Lauderdale, Alabama. Or actually, I'll just put in Alabama as my record to see him listed. If I view record, I see him living with 2 other people. And can zoom in here. And this is where I can see his birthplace listed as Alabama and his age. Now, if I go into the slave schedules, so these are, go to all, and then I am going to search in the 1860 slave schedules. And this is where I'm going to put in G.M. Haley, Alabama. And I see him listed here. Let me see, there we go. So Haley is listed, and then me hover over and see if I can get anything else. And then here are all of the enslaved people on the plantation. Based on the ages, we're able to find that his mother, Sabrina Haley, is most likely the 23-year-old listed. And then if I go back, you go to search, and then I'm going to go to search again, show you. Oh, sorry about that, just a little slow. There we go. So I'm going to go to 1860. And then, let's see. Taking its time, that's okay. And then I'm going to put in James Jackson. And I'll put in Alabama and see what comes up. So I believe it's in Florence. View this record. Also in Lauderdale, Alabama. And then I can view the record if it'll let me. But that's kind of how you have to an example of how you have to go deep on a particular search. Let me go back. Oh. And see him here. So this is also where, let me exit full screen and go into my slides and show with the Forks of Cypress plantation in Lauderdale County. So that is the correct record. Most likely in that list, the 2.5-year-old girl is Victoria Jackson. And so that's an example of taking that Google search, even though it's not the most scholarly search, it is useful for genealogy and especially African American genealogy because there's so much community posted material that can be of use. I do want to get into resources for later. Here are some books that are helpful, some that are just focused on African American genealogy in North Carolina, like the one by Paul Escott. That is useful for family names, for finding plantations, and really building out that search post 1870. The research guides from Wilson Library at UNC and UNC Greensboro are fantastic. I'll also include the one from NC A&T State University. But those are useful because these archives are for the public. And so they're very much designed for supporting you in your research. Some notable collections in digital NC. So the African American newspapers in North Carolina, the Asheville YWCA photograph collection, Heritage of Black Highlanders, the women's clubs. So those were a very important way for Black women to socialize and kind of network in the early 20th century. They have collections from Charlotte and from NC Central. So that's another tool for finding African American women for genealogy research are those women's clubs. And then the African American high schools. So yearbooks, memorabilia from those are useful. And I will show you how to find those exhibits because it's not totally obvious from the homepage of Digital NC. So if you go to Digital NC, and let me see here, browse, browse, and then exhibits. That's where you find all the exhibits that have been curated for particular topics. And so if I want to search in the African American newspapers in North Carolina, this is a particularly useful tool. And again, for folks joining us out of state, this is open to you. You are welcome to search in these. And then I do want to highlight our homegrown collection. This is our ebook collection that we license and make sure that it has unlimited access. So no holds, no checkouts, no wait lists of any kind. An entire community can read the same book at the same time. In this collection, you'll see it's organized nonfiction and fiction on the homepage. And you'll see Black History is a section under nonfiction. And here are some titles that you can find. So some are of oral histories of particular communities in North Carolina, as well as oral histories of formerly enslaved people from Virginia, from South Carolina. And so this is a resource that can be used. Let me. Hey, can you all hear me? I'm really sorry that this audio got cut out. Okay, somebody's saying no audio, but okay. Sorry about that. It's always frustrating when that comes up. My go-to for genealogy is helping patrons find their roots. There are tips for African American genealogy in there. Great to have a desk copy at your library that you can just kind of tab. And it's good for training new staff. I have a copy by my desk at my office that I use frequently. And then I do want to kind of, before we head out, I know we're at time, ask you all, what's one key insight or tip that you'll take away from this webinar in your own genealogy research? Feel free to share it in the chat. Yeah, Jenny. I'm sorry, I cut you off. Crystal, feel free to share. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm on my phone because I started this in the car. I didn't realize I had turned my mic off. I just liked where you went over regarding as far as the names. I have run into that, like just in the ancestry process of like, what's going on, and the nicknames or the misspellings. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I found with the example of Queen, like I kept trying to use Victoria and she's always listed as Queen. And so it's almost like the name Queen is more important in the searching. And the same goes with John D. Ray's wife, Annie. She's listed more often as Nanny as a nickname. Yeah, so folks sharing, checking neighboring houses, realizing that names can be misspelled, checking slave schedules. Um, One thing I will share in the handout is, let me pull this up. The tools from Ancestry are helpful. They're not recommending paid content. I've also linked to the Black Historical Newspapers database from the State Library of North Carolina. And then we didn't get a chance to cover Sanborn maps, but that is useful really more for searching and like kind of figuring out locations in a particular area, mostly for downtowns of towns and cities in the late 18th, early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. I've included the Freedmen's Bureau search portal, Family Search, as well as some African American resources for North Carolina, and then those guides. I'll add, if I didn't include everything in here, but any questions as we kind of wrap up? I'm happy to stick around. And Alana is sharing in the chat, find a grave. Yes, that is helpful as well. So some resources are library resources, and then there's some others like Family Search and Find a Grave that can be used as well.